Welcome to Windows on the World. I'm with Lucy Reynolds and we're going to talk about the junior doctor contracts. We've had Dr. Rishi on, and of course he had his song out, Stand Up, where he's trying to draw public attention to this. So Lucy.
Yes, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the junior doctor contract because unfortunately a lot of the detail of what actually are the problems with this contract has gone over doctors' heads, and it certainly hasn't reached the public. So I just wanted, as somebody who's had a look at that contract in detail and looked at the ramifications of it, to go through some of the problems with it. The first problem is that this contract looks to be extremely dangerous for patients because it's going to require doctors to be chronically overworked. Now, I'm aware of normal job contracts. I've had job contracts in the past where if you are a full-time worker, 35 hours a week, then you are banned from doing any other kind of work. Now, in this contract, the basic for the doctors will be the EU maximum working hours, which is 48 hours a week. They are going to encourage doctors, although apparently not actually force them, but encourage them to opt out of the Working Time Directive, which means an average of 56 hours per week is permitted in terms of hours for those doctors. Now, under those circumstances, you would expect a complete ban on private practice.
Yeah.
Because those doctors should be concentrating on the job for which they're paid. It's very interesting, this contract, because it has a whole chapter protecting the rights of the doctor to do private work, the role of private work generally. It's basically that whole area is protected. So the doctors are allowed to do private work instead of being banned, which they shouldn't. But interestingly, they are simultaneously required to report that to their employer. Which is quite an interesting arrangement because actually the employer should be stopping them doing it. So it would seem that what is happening is that this contract, which is very full of the responsibilities of doctors, they are responsible for making sure that they aren't too tired to work. They're responsible for making sure they're doing the right thing for this patient and that patient. They're required for making sure they've reported all their private practice and not doing too much. What they're basically required to do is set up a court case against them with their employer for the time in the future, and it's not going to be too far in the future actually, because they're bringing this contract in a staggered way over the next year, starting tomorrow in fact. People who are working on those contracts are going to be basically sleepwalking at work within a few months. I think quite a lot of older people remember the time when they were working doctors absolutely ridiculous hours in the 1970s and bad things were happening as a consequence. Well, when the bad things happened then, the NHS, insurance and the legal side picked up all the problems. It's very clear that this time around that's not going to be the way it happens. Because not only are the doctors required to basically collate a load of evidence against themselves for the situation when a patient dies or is harmed and the surviving patient or the patient's family take the hospital to court. Now, they will try to sue the hospital or the healthcare provider rather than the individual doctor for obvious reasons. It's an institutional responsibility. It's not about individual members of staff. But what we see in this contract is that the healthcare provider, of which more in a moment, is setting things up so that when things go wrong for patients, which they very clearly will with these kinds of working hours involved, it will be possible for that organisation to wash its hands. Oh, it's the doctor. Look, they signed up to this contract, they've got all these responsibilities, they didn't do it right, maybe they were a bit too tired, it's not our fault. So really this contract is a strange old thing which puts the responsibilities onto patients. Lawyers I've spoken to about it say this is very peculiar. Where have all the responsibilities of the managers gone? Yeah. Somehow the employing organisation has rights, and the doctors working for it have responsibilities, and that's quite a peculiar thing. So when you look a little more into what has been going on here, it turns out, for one thing, that this contract is not with the NHS. It is with an entity called the employer, which could be part of the proper state NHS, but it could be any old private contractor.
Oh, so that would mean that the doctors are under contract to what will become the privatisation side of it. So if it's, for instance, Virgin Medicare or whatever they're going to call it, then that's, so I see. So they're writing out these contracts as though the NHS has already been privatised. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And doctors have not been warned of this. When we look at who it was that the BMA representatives have been negotiating with on behalf of junior doctors, we see where the problem comes from. Turns out that they haven't been negotiating with the public sector at all, but with an organisation called NHS Employers, which turns out to be part of one of these kind of private sector PR groups. And in fact, this NHS Employers is a group of basically private companies, plus some NHS hospitals, which has been negotiating with the BMA reps directly.
So
now, they ought to have told the people they were negotiating on the behalf of, we haven't even been talking to the public sector, you know, we're dealing now with the private sector direct. All of it's just been kind of ignored.
So, this private company, who are they? Do you know? Are they even a British company? NHS
It's not a single company. It's a partnership arrangement.
Oh, I see.
You know, it's got one of those NHS partnership alliance kind of waffly names. I'm not certain enough to even give you the name definitely. But the organisation that the negotiation has happened with between the BMA, representing the doctors as their union, and the organisation representing supposedly the NHS has in fact not even been part of the public sector. So we are basically seeing a de facto privatisation has happened here. Yeah. But the doctors who will be signing that contract tomorrow, they're certainly not going to be alerted to it. I don't know how long it's going to take for them to find out that they're not actually working for the public sector at all. But we seem to have some difficulties really with this whole business. It's clearly an exercise that is hostile to doctors, and it is likely that given these impossible working hours, it's going to be really unpleasant. The rotas are already threadbare. There are vast holes. Things are already dangerous in the hospitals. Doctors whose main motivation is to help people, they're people who are capable. They have other alternatives in many cases, and I think we're going to see giant holes in the medical workforce, and that is actually intentional, because as we move into a private sector dominated NHS, we see in private medicine generally there are some very starry doctors at the top, and then everything else is downskilled. We want clerks and computers doing it, not qualified medics, because honestly the clerks with computers are more biddable and easy to manage, and they're more inclined to privilege the bottom line for the company, making profits, rather than patient welfare. So we are seeing a repurposing of the system. As the NHS gets turned into an arrangement to make money, these skilled doctors, they're not wanted any longer. So the government has deliberately picked a fight with them and is putting them onto an impossible contract, which will see them potentially harming their patients, but certainly leaving in droves.
If you sign a contract with the employer, who is it?
Well, I imagine actually that in specific contracts, that employer block will be substituted by the name of the legal entity.
Yeah.
But the public has not been alerted to the fact that actually our hospitals aren't the NHS anymore properly. They are contractors for the NHS. Yes.
That's the most important thing, really. I just wanted to sort of bring that up again.
And in terms of the hours, you know, maybe the 56 hours average working week doesn't sound too terrible to people, but we have been looking at other professions where there are potential dangers to the public. And we've discovered that it would not be legal to work a lorry driver in this country, those hours. They have a 10-hour maximum shift. Our doctors will be worked much, much longer. Now, clearly, having a lorry potentially out of control because the driver has dropped off to sleep is bad news. But honestly, it's possible for two tired doctors to do quite a lot of damage as well. And maybe that's the idea. Maybe the intention is actually to bring what is left of the NHS into such disrepute that it becomes non-viable.
Yeah, called managed decline. So Indeed. They're basically bringing it into a completely privatised system. Yeah, I just thought I'd kind of clarify that, because that's very interesting. So your contract is now with the employer, not the NHS. That's a very, very important point. So just everybody out there, remember that the NHS has been privatised under your noses, and see our other show called Stand Up with Dr. Rishi. That's about the junior doctors, and he's a junior doctor and he explains a lot of the background of this.